Guess who's back? The Motown Phenom touches down once more in Las Vegas. Coming up this weekend, the former multiple-time main eventer with UFC. It's Kevin Lee. He's taking on the Gladiator, Rinat Fakhretdinov, a man who's won 16 fights in a row, the former GFC middleweight champion. That's a big thing for Rinat Fakhretdinov. Lots of middleweight experience coming into the UFC. And for Kevin Lee, we know the story. Lightweight up to welterweight. And then it was kind of a rocky road there. Loses to Daniel Rodriguez. And he's out of the UFC. And Lee, there were a lot of weight miss struggles on the way through. He missed weight when he was taking on Charles Oliveira. And ultimately, he ends up in a super lightweight fight with Eagle FC, a multi-fight deal. There's going to be so much Kevin Lee. And although that fight that he had against Diego Sanchez has 1.4 million views on YouTube, Kevin Lee had an issue in the first round with his knee, and it was that left knee, and you saw that as the fight wore on. Now, Lee went out there on Instagram, and he said he didn't need surgery on it. He'd be back kind of later on last year. But ultimately, that fight against Sanchez was last spring, and we haven't seen him since. And Kevin Lee, where the weight miss issues were a struggle when he was with the UFC, the knee issues were a big struggle too. So a lot of injury problems for Kevin Lee, and that potential was never really realized. He did have that, interim lightweight title fight against Tony Ferguson at UFC 216, and if you want to go back and see an awesome fight, it's that one against Tony Ferguson. But Kevin Lee was known for big explosion into big strikes. He had good boxing.
You're going to love this guy.
Awesome kicks on the outside to go along with that Grand Valley State wrestling that he had in his back pocket. Kevin Lee, one of those guys that you had to watch out for. But then 11-7 to the end. He has that weird fight against Diego Sanchez, who was on the outs with the UFC as well. And now he takes on that kind of rising up-and-comer in Rinat Fakhretdinov.
Kevin Lee is Kristaps Porzingis. We talked about him on Question Mark Kicks, and it's a great example of another athlete in another sport who has followed a similar career trajectory, because I was going to ask you, who's your favorite, one-time All-Star, two-time All-Star from any sport? You know, there's always those guys out there who, when they retire...
Steve Delabar.
There you go. When they retire, are they going to be Hall of Famers? No. But if you were a fan of that team, you were probably a huge fan of that player, and they had a lot of lasting moments in your life. Kevin Lee was one of those fighters. He was pushed heavily by the UFC. He had that great main event with Michael Chiesa where they promoted it in that summertime event.
6 main events Kevin Lee had.
But remember his fast rise to the top? He lost to Santos, your boy, way back in the day, and a lot of people thought that would have derailed his hype train. But to Kevin Lee's credit, he was able to rebuild himself. And Lee is an interesting wrestler because a lot of people look at Kevin Lee and they assume he fights in the style of an Usman or a Covington. But he really doesn't. His wrestling does set up his jiu-jitsu more than anything. And that's what makes Kevin Lee so special. He is a phenomenal wrestler, but he's a really good back taker too, and that's what makes him so dangerous. He is insanely physically strong, but here's the problem with Kevin Lee. He burns so hot when he grapples that you do worry about what's going to happen after. And I think a good example of that is the Rafael Dos Anjos fight. And I know Dos Anjos is kind of an all-time great fighter, but at that stage in his career, that's not prime RDA, right? He had been through a lot of main events. He had lost to a lot of the elite at 170.
He's looked good since then.
He has, but I don't think a lot of people look at Rafael Dos Anjos and look at him as the same fighter who fought during UFC 200.
Not after this weekend on Twitter, they don't.
And won the lightweight championship. My point is, that was a very winnable fight for Kevin Lee, and he looked very good until he didn't, and that's been the big issue with Kevin Lee. He has all the skills in the world, but if he uses them a little bit too much and he doesn't monitor his gas tank, how many times do we see Kevin Lee huff and puff for gas in that third round? It is concerning. Even in fights where he has won in the past, that third round is, hey, you win the first two, bank them, and then we'll see what happens. And I do think the Ally Quinta matchup the second time around that main event was the first one that really made people realize, okay, Kevin Lee might not be ready to fight for the title at 155. Now, to his credit, and you bring it up, this is a 170 matchup, and I think this is the division for Kevin Lee. The weight misses, the weight issues at 155, they were just too numerous for me to want to see him back down to that weight class, so hopefully we just see a better version of him. But I'm saying the same thing as I am with Kristaps this season with the Celtics. Now, Kristaps at least gave us a good sample size where he looked really good with Washington, so it gives you hope, but Kevin Lee has had a long time off, and you bring up the Diego Sanchez fight. He got outstruck in some of those moments against Diego Sanchez, and I know the knee was an issue. I'm not discrediting that whatsoever, but that's not promising to see. You know, Kevin Lee getting touched up by an older Sanchez.
Yeah, Kevin Lee, if you do consider it, I mean, I thought going back and watching his rematch against Ally Quinta, because Kevin Lee's first fight in the UFC was against Ally Quinta. Ally Quinta won it. Lee was favored to beat Ally Quinta in the second fight, and from the first round to the third round, Kevin Lee looked pretty good, but he burned a little bit too hot in that. So we'll have a look at how this one goes. He's training at Killcliff FC, and for Lee, I mean, that was another big thing. Michigan, and then down to Vegas, and if you look at his fight against Tony Ferguson, he's got an old no-sleeve Dewey Cooper with him in that corner, and we've seen Kevin Lee kind of mismatch some of his training together. He trained at TriStar for the longest time, and now at Killcliff. So if you do consider it, I have one weird thing about this fight, and I threw it out there on Twitter. Rinat Fakhretdinov relinquished his GFC middleweight belt because he didn't want to fight his Muslim brothers. He's taking on Kevin Lee in this fight, who is a Muslim. So it's going to be a little odd. But the thing with beliefs are, you can change them if you want. Wow. So that is a good thing. But we'll see if this fight takes place this weekend.
I was just going to say something about Fakhretdinov because I've spent the last 10 minutes going on about Kevin Lee. This is the thing about Fakhretdinov that it does worry me if you're a big fan of Kevin Lee and if you're a supporter of Lee. He makes you pay if he hits you with big shots. And if Kevin Lee is as susceptible to the power shot at 170 as we saw at 155, and there is reason to believe that, right? Daniel Rodriguez, although didn't knock him out, put him on skates how many times in that fight, really outstruck him. And Fakhretdinov might not have the same level of speed, but he does fight a little bit like Daniel Rodriguez in the way that...
Are you kidding? No. Not a chance.
No, he doesn't. But the way that he throws his strikes are from that odd angle where he'll hold his hands down and throw those over the top. I think he might be able to throw an odd shot and hurt Kevin Lee.
Daniel Rodriguez, I mean, we saw it last weekend.
Rodriguez is
a southpaw that they would call a technical brawler who boxes on the outside. Fakhretdinov is orthodox and throws big looping shots like Alexei Oleinik.
Those looping shots are what I mean, though. Those looping shots are the thing that have hurt Kevin Lee in the past, and I think they could hurt him again. Lee's a guy who holds his hands up very high, and he won't maneuver a lot after that. Those looping shots go around. I agree with you. It's not a perfect combination. Goodness, you're fired up. But Fakhretdinov throws those looping shots that Kevin Lee's been hurt by. Look at Ali Aquinta. He doesn't throw straight shots down the middle. He was throwing hooks that were hurting Kevin Lee.
We saw Fakhretdinov land that big shot from distance against Eric Spicely. The hooks were landing, kind of more of a right cross landed, and Spicely was down. Down goes Spicely.
A lot of people's introduction to
call heard around the world. But Fakhretdinov fought good competition. Even before that, he beat Alberto Uda, who was in the UFC. He had some good wins. But it really is the fact that he has combat sambo and a little bit of that pancration to pull out of his back pocket to use in these fights. And in the UFC, 2-fight sample size, Fakhretdinov 2-0, scores 2, 30-27, 2, 30-26, 2, 30-25, and a short right hand was the one that also dropped Brian Battle in that matchup in that third round. So if you look at it for Fakhretdinov, I mean, training at Evolve MMA with Damir Ismagulov, he is one of those guys that just grapples and grapples and grapples. And I thought the cardio would be an issue for Fakhretdinov at welterweight because he was previously a middleweight, but we haven't really seen that so far. But the biggest thing that scared me for Fakhretdinov outside of the UFC is throwing those big looping shots is awesome, but when your hands are below your chest and you have them chopper height, that's where you get hit yourself. And for Lee from that southpaw stance, a lot of those big kicks, a lot of the head kicks.
He has a good jab, too.
You have a good jab, and you saw him hurt, even in that first round against Tony Ferguson. He hurts Ferguson, and Ferguson, like David Onama, starts wiping that eye, and the commentary team goes, oh, it must have been an eye poke. It was a punch that Kevin Lee landed, and then he starts to rush in, drops his own hands, and Ferguson lands a left hook that drops Kevin Lee. So both of these guys with the striking, it can be 50-50. Both of them great with the wrestling in their own respect. For me, with Kevin Lee, 3 performance bonuses in the UFC. One against Mustafayev, one that he had against Chiesa, and one against, you talk about where is he? Gregor Gillespie took that money after beating CDF, but where has he been? Just fishing in northern New York. If you look at it for Lee, he definitely has a shot, but he's not favored to win the matchup. Fakhretdinov is, I threw this one out there to everybody on our Twitter, at Fight Night Picks, and everybody's going with Fakhretdinov. So I'm going to look at the topology votes and say over under 80% Fakhretdinov. Let's say you.
Over, and I can't believe I'm saying that.
All right, it is over. So 810 total votes, 83% Fakhretdinov, 76% by decision. For the 17% that have Lee, 70% by decision. And for the millions watching on YouTube around the world, where Kamaru Usman said that Kevin Lee was a top 15 welterweight that they were watching in that fight. He actually said that.
Again, Sean Anik said Miranda Maverick was going to be fighting Valentina any day. So.
I thought Adolfo Vieira would be fighting for the belt by now. But when you look at a matchup like this, Lee plodding forward against Diego Sanchez and not really having success, but he looked really good in the grappling. Sanchez is a good grappler. So I do like Rinat Fakhretdinov with that motor on him. If Lee knocked him out, it wouldn't surprise me because I was so down on Fakhretdinov striking coming into the UFC. But it's just the fact that it's takedown, rinse, and repeat, and the top pressure of a guy like Fakhretdinov that I like him to win.
It's a weird fight because if Kevin Lee loses the first round, I think he can win it. I know that's a weird thing to say, but Lee has a solid 11-minute burn to him. And if he loses the first round, that still gives him round 2 and 3 to go out there and wrestle because cardio isn't his issue. It's pacing that's his issue. If you go and look at any of his fights, the Ally Quinta fight, the RDA fight, he's going out there and performing ridiculous takedowns at an insanely high level that really no athlete in the world can keep up for a solid 25 minutes or 15 minutes. So if Lee can fix his pacing issues, I think that would solve a lot in his career. I agree with you, though. I do have Fakhretdinov in this fight because the hooks in the boxing that he throws is going to eliminate some of those kicks from Lee. And Lee, when he's having the most success as a striker, is when he's moving forward, when he's working behind that jab, threatening with his own takedowns. And I just don't know if those threats are going to be there against a guy like Rinat.
A big-time matchup. I never thought I would say that I had Rinat Fakhretdinov to beat Kevin Lee, but I'm saying it right now. We'll see how it plays out on Saturday. I know you guys are fired up for this one. Let us know what you have down below in the comments section. In the fight, some big-time bangers left on this card, including Damir Ismagulov taking on Grant Dawson. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it.